Okay, everybody. So in this video, we're going to be learning about the 14 steps of blood flow. And this is really going to help you in an introductory biology class because when you first learn about the cardiovascular system, your professor might throw a lot of terms at you, for example, vein, artery, valve, aorta, atrium, and so on, right? And when you're first exposed to all these terms, it's going to be pretty confusing, like how do I map this out? How do I know that blood transfers from point A to point B to point C to point D, right? Because there's a lot of processes going on and so on. But I did my best to try to map it out and to just make your lives a little bit simpler when you finally get exposed to learning about the cardiovascular system, okay? And basically speaking, when blood flows from the body to the heart to the lungs, that can be characterized or basically outlined in a series of 14 main steps. Okay, so other videos, some textbooks might have a picture of the heart and try to show you, or like a computer diagram or whatever, but I did my best to write it on paper, kind of have it in like a flowchart, mapish type of method, because some people like to learn that way. I know I like to learn that way, so hopefully this method will kind of make you feel a little bit better when you're learning about this type of stuff. Okay, so the first of the 14 steps, we're going to start with the body, okay? And the body can be defined as anything that's not the heart or the lungs, all right? So it's basically a pretty broad definition of the body, okay? Just don't include the heart, don't include the lungs. They're in their own category in the other steps, okay? And within the body, you have oxygen, O2, that is delivered to cells. And in addition, you have CO2 and other wastes that are picked up from the cells, right? Because the cells want oxygen, they need oxygen in order to survive, but the cells don't want CO2 or other wasteful products to be inside them, because then cells can experience negative effects and they can eventually die, okay? Now, after blood is in the body, it goes to the vena cava. The vena cava is just a fancy term for a type of vein, okay? And there are two types of vena cavas. There's a superior vena cava and there's an inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava basically deals with the upper part of the body, and the inferior vena cava deals with the lower part of the body, okay? And to just make it a little bit simpler, for example, you could make the analogy superior is greater or higher than inferior, and upper is better than lower. Maybe that analogy could help you. So that's just one way to know it. So let's say, for example, you're dealing with like an upper part of the body, you're dealing with the upper shoulders, right? So in that case, blood would go from the body all the way to the superior vena cava, because you're dealing with a part of the body that's in the upper half, okay? All right, so after the blood is in the vena cava, it then goes to the heart, all right? We start at the heart, and we start at the right atrium, all right? That's the name. And after blood is in the right atrium, it moves to the right atrioventricular valve, which is also called the tricuspid valve, all right? So one important thing to take away from this is that some of the valves, they have different names. Your professor might call them tricuspid, another one might call them right atrioventricular valve. Just be aware of both of those terms, okay? I personally like right atrioventricular valve because it's pretty self-explanatory. It goes from the right atrium to the right atrioventricular valve. Why is it atrioventricular? Because we have atrium before and we have ventricle after. So the blood goes from the right atrium all the way to the right AV valve, and then it goes to the right ventricle. All right, and after the blood is in the world of the right ventricle, it then journeys all the way to the pulmonary valve, and it passes by the pulmonary valve. It goes to the pulmonary artery, then it goes to the lungs. All right, the lungs in the body. So in the lungs, oxygen is picked up from the lungs, right? Because it's picked up from the lungs because the cells in the body, like from over here, remember, the cells want oxygen, but how does blood pick up the oxygen that cells need? The blood has to go to the lungs to pick it up, all right? And in addition, CO2 is delivered / released onto the lungs, right? So that's why you breathe in oxygen and you exhale carbon dioxide, CO2, because CO2 is delivered to the lungs, and then when you exhale, the CO2, which is one of the wastes, it's taken out of the body, okay, into the air, all right? So after the blood is in the lungs, it then tries to go back to the heart and eventually back to the body. We'll get there later. So after the lungs, the blood ventures to the pulmonary vein, then it goes to the left atrium, and then it goes to the left atrioventricular valve. And this type of valve is a doozy because it has two alternate names also. It can also be called the mitral valve, or it can also be called the bicuspid valve, okay? Again, left atrioventricular valve is a lot more self-explanatory, a lot easier to memorize, okay? And then after it passes through this left AV valve, just the abbreviation, the blood then goes to the right ventricle and then through the aortic valve and then to the aorta, which is another term for the arteries in the body. And then finally, the blood goes back to the body and the cycle continues, okay? And one other thing to take into account is that when the ventricle contracts, let's look at the right part of the heart, let's look at the right ventricle. So here's the ventricle, right? It goes like, get out of here. The ventricle contracts because it wants blood to get away from it, like, get out of here, go. So that's the blood, so it contracts, and the blood goes through the pulmonary valve, and it goes to the pulmonary artery, right? So the right ventricle, which was tense before, it's like, oh, good riddance. So now, after contracting and getting the blood out of it, then the right ventricle can relax. But let's say, for example, if blood could think, if blood had a mind, what if blood was thinking, oh, I don't want to be in the pulmonary artery, the right ventricle seems kind of more relaxed now, let me just go back to it. And then if that happens, none of this happens, then you have serious problems with the body. But you know what? That normally can't really happen because the pulmonary valve, just like the other valves, the point of valves is to prevent blood backflow. So as a result, when the right ventricle contracts like, get out of here, blood, the blood goes through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary artery. Blood cannot flow back because once blood passes by the valve and it gets to the artery, the valve closes. It's like, bye-bye, boom, the pulmonary valve closes. So if blood did want to go back, it couldn't because the door is locked, the door is closed, and the blood does not have a key to open the door, so therefore it has to go through the lungs and go through the rest of the cycle, okay? So that's a very, very important thing, a very, very important role for the valves. They are meant to prevent blood backflow, okay? And you can make a similar analogy with the left ventricle. It contracts, get out of here, blood. It goes through the aortic valve, and then the blood goes to the aorta. But let's say the blood doesn't want to go to the body. It wants to go back, but it cannot flow back because once the blood gets to the aorta, the aortic valve is like bye-bye, and it closes. King, it's locked. Blood cannot go back, so the blood has to go to the body, and the cycle continues. Okay. So that's basically an outline of the 14 steps of blood flow. Hopefully this video really helped you guys, and thank you for watching.